The envelope sat on the music stand for 3 hours before anyone touched it. The James Brown Revue was scheduled to perform at the Atlanta Municipal Auditorium that night. And every musician knew the pre-show routine by heart. Arrive 4 hours early, set up equipment in precise configurations that James had mapped out years ago, run through the set list twice under his supervision, and then wait in nervous silence for the moment when the Godfather would walk in and decide if they were ready. But this time, something was different. Maceo Parker's saxophone was still in its case. His music stand held only that envelope, white and unmarked except for 2 words written in his distinctive handwriting. Read this. The trumpet player saw it first, but didn't dare pick it up. The drummer noticed it during sound check and looked away. Bobby Bird stood in front of it for a full minute, his hands shaking, knowing that whatever was inside that envelope was going to change everything, but unwilling to be the one who broke the seal. And when James Brown finally stormed backstage, 45 minutes before showtime, demanding to know where his saxophone player was, someone finally opened the letter and read aloud the words that Maceo had spent weeks perfecting. Words that would reveal the impossible tension between artistic genius and human limitation. Before we dive deeper into what that letter revealed and why it marked a turning point for one of music's most revolutionary partnerships, make sure you're subscribed to this channel. We're bringing you the untold stories behind the legends you thought you knew. And this one will show you the complex reality behind funk's greatest era. Maceo Parker didn't wake up one morning and decide to walk away from greatness. The decision had been building for years, layered like sediment at the bottom of a river, each moment adding weight until the pressure became unbearable. He had joined James Brown's band in 1964, a 21-year-old saxophone prodigy from Kinston, North Carolina, who could make his instruments speak in tongues. James recognized his talent immediately, the way a master craftsman spots exceptional raw material. And within weeks, Maceo's horn had become the signature sound of the James Brown Revue. That distinctive, punchy saxophone tone cut through "Papa's Got a Brand New Bag" like a knife. And when Maceo hit those staccato bursts during "I Got You," audiences lost their minds. The partnership was magical. 2 brilliant minds creating something that had never existed before in American music. James Brown's genius wasn't just in his performing ability or his songwriting. It was in his vision of what black music could become. His understanding that funk was more than entertainment. It was revolution. He had built an empire from absolute nothing, rising from crushing poverty in Barnwell, South Carolina, surviving a childhood that would have destroyed most people, and creating a sound that changed the entire trajectory of popular music. Every detail mattered to James because he understood something that many artists never grasp. Greatness requires obsessive attention to things other people think are insignificant. The precision he demanded, the rehearsal schedules that seemed impossible, the insistence on perfect timing and execution. These weren't arbitrary cruelties. They were the foundation of innovation. James Brown invented funk by refusing to accept anything less than perfection, and that refusal transformed American culture. What the audience saw was magic. What the musicians lived was something far more complicated. James Brown called himself the hardest working man in show business, and he meant it absolutely. The phrase wasn't marketing. It was literal truth. The James Brown Revue performed 300 nights a year, sometimes more, a touring schedule that reflected James's belief that success required relentless dedication. They would finish a show in one city late at night, drive through darkness to the next venue, arrive at dawn, and do it all over again. For James, who had clawed his way out of poverty through sheer determination, This schedule made perfect sense. He had learned early that the world wouldn't give him anything, that every opportunity had to be seized and maximized, that rest was a luxury he couldn't afford. He brought that same philosophy to his band, expecting them to match his legendary work ethic. The challenge was that James's superhuman drive came from a unique combination of talent, trauma, and iron will that not everyone possessed. He genuinely believed he was preparing his musicians for greatness, teaching them the discipline that had saved his own life. The structure he created, the fines for lateness, the insistence on exact performance standards, the demanding rehearsal schedule, reflected his understanding of what it took to succeed in an industry designed to exploit black artists. James had seen too many talented musicians destroyed by lack of discipline, had watched brilliant careers collapse because artists couldn't maintain professional standards. His strictness was his way of protecting his band, ensuring they would be so good, so tight, so professional, that no one could ever dismiss or diminish them. But protection and control can look remarkably similar from different angles, and what felt like necessary discipline to James sometimes felt like something else entirely to the musicians living under that system. The breaking point came on a Tuesday night in Memphis, 3 weeks before Maceo would write the letter, during a performance that should have been a celebration, but instead became the moment when irreconcilable differences finally crystallized. They were playing the Orpheum Theater, a beautiful old venue with gilt molding and red velvet seats, the kind of place that made you remember why music mattered. The show was spectacular. The audience was electric, feeding energy back to the stage in that reciprocal magic that makes live performance transcendent. Maceo was in the zone, his saxophone singing through cold sweat, hitting every note with the kind of precision that comes from 10,000 hours of practice and innate genius working in perfect harmony. And then James stopped the show. Right in the middle of the song, at the peak of its momentum, James cut off the band with a hand gesture and turned to face Maceo. The audience went quiet, confused, wondering if this was part of the performance or if something had gone wrong. James walked across the stage until he was standing directly in front of Maceo, and then he spoke into his microphone, loud enough for everyone to hear, 4 words that would echo in Maceo's mind for the rest of his life. "You're playing too good." The audience laughed, thinking it was James Brown doing his showman thing, building up his talented saxophonist before launching into another explosive section. And perhaps that's exactly what James intended, a moment of theatrical praise, his way of acknowledging Maceo's brilliance while maintaining control of the show's energy and pacing. James was, after all, a master of performance dynamics, and he understood instinctively how to manage a crowd's attention. But in that moment, something in the delicate balance between these two brilliant artists shifted irrevocably. Maceo heard something different in those words, felt something that made him question whether this partnership could continue, and the show resumed with a new tension hanging in the air. After Memphis, Maceo began the difficult process of examining a relationship that had defined his adult life. He thought about what it meant to be part of something larger than yourself, to subordinate individual recognition for collective achievement. James Brown had taught him things about music that he could have learned nowhere else. The precision, the timing, the understanding of how rhythm could physically move human bodies. These were gifts that James had generously shared. Maceo had watched James work through exhaustion, through illness, through personal tragedy, always delivering performances that left audiences stunned. There was something almost superhuman about James's dedication, and being close to that level of commitment had elevated Maceo's own artistry in ways he would always appreciate. But Maceo also recognized that he had reached a point where his own artistic voice was struggling to emerge within a structure designed around one man's singular vision. This wasn't a judgment about right or wrong. It was simply a recognition that different artists need different environments to flourish. James had created a revolutionary musical organization. But revolution requires total commitment to a unified vision. And Maceo was beginning to hear melodies that didn't fit within that framework. The realization was painful, because it meant acknowledging that sometimes two brilliant people can both be right and still be incompatible. Writing the letter took weeks. Maceo would work on it late at night after shows, sitting in motel rooms with paper spread across polyester bedspreads, trying to find words that could express profound respect alongside necessary separation. He wanted to be honest but honorable, clear but not destructive. This wasn't about anger or revenge. It was about recognizing that a chapter had to close so new chapters could begin. The final version was 3 pages, handwritten in Maceo's careful script, choosing each word with the precision he brought to his musical phrasing. He didn't list grievances or assign blame. Instead, he wrote about gratitude for everything he had learned, acknowledgement of James's genius and the revolutionary music they had created together, and honest recognition that he needed to explore his own artistic path. He wrote about the late-night conversations with other band members who were feeling similar tensions, the collective sense that they had learned everything they could in this environment and needed to test themselves in new ways. And then, in the final paragraph, he made his decision clear with dignity and respect. He was leaving, effective immediately, and other musicians who felt similarly were coming with him. The Atlanta Municipal Auditorium show was supposed to be a celebration. James was planning to record portions of the performance for a potential live album, capturing the James Brown Revue at the height of their powers, documenting for posterity the machine that he had built through vision and relentless work. The venue had been booked for months. Promotional materials had been distributed across the city, and ticket sales had been strong. Everything was aligned for a triumphant performance, the kind of show that would remind the music world why James Brown was called the Godfather of Soul. But when the band arrived for load-in at 3 p.m, Maceo Parker wasn't with them. Neither was Fred Wesley, or the bass player, or 2 of the backing vocalists. Half of the James Brown Revue had simply vanished, and the only explanation was that white envelope sitting on the music stand, waiting like a message from the future about changes that couldn't be stopped. The remaining musicians went through the motions of setup, but the atmosphere was strange, charged with an anxiety that had nothing to do with performance nerves and everything to do with the knowledge that they were watching history pivot on an unexpected axis. Bobby Bird tried calling Maceo's hotel room, but the front desk said he had checked out hours ago. The road manager made frantic phone calls to other band members who had disappeared, but no one answered. And still that envelope sat there. 3 folded pages that everyone knew contained information that would change everything. When James finally arrived, his entrance was typically magnificent. He swept through the backstage area like a force of nature already. Dressed in his performance clothes, a gold lame suit that caught the overhead lights and threw sparkles across the concrete walls. He was talking, giving orders, demanding updates on the sound system and the lighting cues, and a dozen other technical details that he managed with the precision of a master craftsman. And then he stopped, mid-sentence, because he had noticed what everyone else had been trying not to see. The music stand, the envelope, and the absence of the saxophone that should have been resting beside it. Bobby Bird picked up the envelope with shaking hands and began to read. His voice was quiet at first, barely audible over the ambient noise of roadies moving equipment and sound engineers running tests. But as he continued, a strange silence fell over the backstage area. Everyone stopped what they were doing. Everyone turned to watch James Brown's face as Bobby read Maceo's words, watching for the reaction that would tell them how to feel, how to respond, what would happen next. And what they saw was something unexpected. James Brown, the man who controlled every aspect of his performance and his life, the man who had built an empire through sheer force of will, stood completely still, absorbing information that he hadn't anticipated, processing a reality he hadn't prepared for. The specific words of Maceo's letter have been the subject of speculation for decades. No complete copy has ever been made public, and the people who heard it read that night have given varying accounts of its contents, each filtered through their own memories and loyalties. But certain elements have emerged from multiple sources, creating a composite picture of what Maceo actually wrote. He acknowledged the revolutionary music they had created together, the way James's vision had transformed not just their careers, but American culture itself. He expressed genuine gratitude for the apprenticeship he had received, the musical education that only James Brown could have provided. He praised James's work ethic, his refusal to accept mediocrity, his understanding of how perfection was achieved through relentless practice and unwavering standards. But he also wrote honestly about the toll that such intensity takes on human beings, the way even the most dedicated artists need space for rest and personal exploration. He described his need to discover his own voice, to test his abilities outside the structure that had nurtured him, to see what he could create when he was making his own choices. He framed his departure not as rejection, but as graduation, the natural progression of a student who had learned everything the master could teach, and now needed to apply those lessons independently. And he made clear that other musicians felt similarly, that this wasn't one person's complaint, but rather a collective recognition that a season had ended and new seasons were beginning. The show that night was challenging in ways that had nothing to do with musical ability. James tried to perform with hastily assembled substitute musicians, pulling in local players who knew some of the songs but couldn't replicate the telepathic precision that had made the James Brown Revue legendary. The sound was different. The arrangements had to be simplified. And James himself seemed to be navigating unfamiliar emotional territory, performing through circumstances he had never encountered. The audience, who had paid to see the hardest working man in show business at his peak, witnessed something rare. James Brown adapting in real time to unexpected change, showing the professional resilience that had always been part of his genius, even as the performance couldn't match the usual standard. Maceo Parker's departure wasn't just one musician leaving one band. It was a turning point that ultimately strengthened funk music by spreading its innovations across the entire industry. Within weeks, the musicians who had left began forming their own groups, pursuing their own visions, taking the techniques and philosophies they had learned from James Brown and applying them in new contexts. Fred Wesley became a sought-after arranger and band leader, helping shape the sound of funk and jazz fusion for decades. The rhythm section that had defined the James Brown sound started working with other artists, taking the revolutionary approach to timing and groove that James had perfected and sharing it across genres. In a very real sense, James Brown's influence expanded rather than diminished, as musicians he had trained became teachers themselves, spreading the gospel of funk precision throughout the music world. James, for his part, demonstrated the same resilience that had characterized his entire career. He rebuilt the band, hired new musicians, adapted his approach in subtle but meaningful ways, and continued creating groundbreaking music for decades. The later versions of the James Brown Revue were different, but still revolutionary, still innovative, still pushing boundaries. James himself seemed to learn from the experience, occasionally reaching out to former band members, offering opportunities for reunion performances, showing a flexibility that perhaps hadn't been as evident in earlier years. The relationship between James and Maceo eventually evolved into something more balanced, mutual respect between two masters who had traveled different paths from their shared starting point. Maceo Parker went on to have a remarkable solo career, touring the world, recording critically acclaimed albums, collaborating with artists from Prince to the Dave Matthews Band. He became an ambassador for funk, teaching new generations about the music's history and possibilities, always generous in crediting James Brown's influence, while also making clear that great teaching ultimately empowers students to find their own voices. In interviews, when asked about those years with James Brown, Maceo would talk about the music with genuine appreciation, describing the creative breakthroughs and the incredible performances, acknowledging the gift of having learned from one of music's true geniuses, while also being honest about the challenges of working within such an intense environment. James Brown never fully replicated the exact magic of that original lineup, but that's perhaps beside the point. The music he created with Maceo and the others remains timeless, revolutionary recordings that changed the course of popular music. And the music he created after they left continued to innovate and inspire, proving that James's genius wasn't dependent on any single configuration, but rather on his relentless drive to push music forward. The story isn't about failure or success. It's about the natural evolution of artistic relationships, the way creative partnerships sometimes need to transform in order for everyone involved to reach their full potential. The envelope represented more than one musician's departure. It represented the complexity of artistic collaboration, the tension between collective vision and individual expression, the challenge of balancing discipline with freedom. James Brown's demanding approach created some of the most innovative music in American history, and it also created conditions that eventually required talented artists to find new paths. Both things can be true simultaneously. The letter Maceo Parker wrote wasn't an indictment. It was an acknowledgement that sometimes the teacher's greatest success is creating students who become masters themselves, and that revolution requires not just creating something new, but also empowering others to carry that innovation forward in unexpected directions.